This is the story of Flight MH, the Boeing 777 that disappeared over the Indian Ocean in 2014. It is one of the biggest aviation mysteries in history, and in this video, I want to look at what really happened to this aircraft. On March 8, 2014, a Boeing 777-7300 took off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport at 12:41 a.m. bound for Beijing. The plane was full of 227 passengers and 12 crew members. The flight was expected to take just under 7 hours, but 4 hours into the flight, shortly after the plane passed over the coast of Vietnam, it went off course and veered out over the Indian Ocean. Search and rescue efforts were quickly launched, but no trace of the aircraft was found. And, to this day, the disappearance of MH370 remains a mystery. There have been many theories as to what could have caused this accident, ranging from pilot suicide to hijacking to mechanical failure. But in this video, I want to present the evidence for and against each of these possibilities. First up, let's consider the possibility that the pilots were responsible for the crash. This could have been deliberate, as in the pilots intentionally crashed the plane, or it could have been accidental, as in the pilots accidentally put the plane into a state from which they could not recover. If we look at the flight data, there are three pieces of information that stand out. First, the plane was cruising at an altitude of 34,000 feet, which is well within the normal cruising altitude range of a Boeing 777. The plane was traveling at a speed of 479 knots, which is just above the normal cruising speed of a Boeing 777. And third, the plane had turned off its transponder, which is used to provide the plane's altitude and speed to air traffic control. So first off, the fact that the plane was cruising at a normal altitude and speed would argue against the pilots deliberately crashing the plane. If they had planned to crash the plane, then they likely would have wanted to be at a lower altitude and speed, where the plane was more likely to be intercepted by military radar. And the fact that they turned off the transponder would argue in favor of them deliberately crashing the plane. If they had accidentally put the plane into a state from which they could not recover, then they would have likely tried to turn on the transponder again, so that air traffic control could see that they were in trouble. The next piece of information we need to look at is the satellite data. Shortly after takeoff from Kuala Lumpur, MH370 deviated from its flight path and began heading west instead of east. At this point, the pilots likely realized that something was wrong and that they needed to get the plane back on course. They would have done this by inputting the correct coordinates into the plane's navigation system. But around 1 hour into the flight, the plane deviated again, this time heading even further west. At this point, the pilots likely realized that something was very wrong and that they needed to land the plane as soon as possible. They would have done this by turning on the landing lights and then following the same procedure as if they were landing at an airport. But the pilots never turned on the landing lights, and the plane continued to fly west until it ran out of fuel and crashed into the Indian Ocean. So what caused this accident? Well, there are two possible explanations. The first explanation is that someone on board the plane caused it to crash. This could have been a passenger, a member of the cabin crew, or one of the pilots. But if we look at the flight data, there is one piece of information that stands out. The plane was manually flown for almost the entire flight. There were no autopilot engaged commands logged in the flight data recorder. This means that someone was at the controls of the plane at all times. Now, it is possible that the pilots set the plane on autopilot before they lost control of it, but there is no evidence to support this theory. In fact, the only autopilot engaged command that was logged in the flight data recorder was after the plane had already started to turn west. This suggests that whoever was in control of the plane at this point knew exactly what they were doing. In other words, this suggests that the crash was deliberate. But who did it? Well, the most likely suspect is the pilot who was flying the plane when it crashed. But there is one piece of information that does not fit with this theory. The last communication between MH370 and air traffic control was at 1:19 a.m. At this time, the plane was at 35,000 feet. And the pilots were talking about making a slight course correction to get the plane back on track. But at 1:21 a.m., the plane started to descend. Now, if the pilot who was flying the plane at the time decided to crash the plane, then he would have done everything in his power to prevent it from descending. In fact, he would have done everything in his power to keep the plane in the air for as long as possible. The only reason for the descent would have been because the plane was running out of fuel. But if the pilot had acted quickly enough, he would have been able to prevent the plane from crashing. So the question is, Why didn't he? Well, the answer is that he didn't know that the plane was running out of fuel. He only realized this after the plane started to descend. So the conclusion is that the pilot who was flying the plane at the time must have made a mistake. This could have been a small navigational error or a miscalculation in fuel consumption. Whatever it was, it would have led to the plane losing altitude and eventually crashing into the Indian Ocean. The second explanation is that something on the plane caused it to crash. This could have been a mechanical failure or a problem with the plane's navigation system. But if we look at the flight data, there is one piece of information that stands out. The plane was behaving erratically in the final stages of flight. The data shows that the plane was making sharp turns and descending rapidly. This suggests that something on the plane had failed, causing the pilots to lose control. But if this is true, then why did the pilots not attempt to land the plane? After all, this is what they were trained to do in such situations. Well, the answer is that they couldn't. The erratic behavior of the plane would have made it impossible to land. In fact, it would have made it almost impossible to do anything. In the end, MH370 was probably taken off course by some sort of technical error, after which the pilots lost control of the aircraft, and the plane crashed into the Indian Ocean. That is probably what happened to the disappeared Boeing. As for why this plane specifically crashed, we don't really know. It could have been a random event. Maybe there was a problem with the maintenance of this plane, or maybe there was a problem with the design of the plane, or maybe it was a combination of both. We don't really know, but the important thing to remember is that this could happen to any plane, not just Boeing 777s. In fact, it could even happen to a Boeing 737 MAX. Some people seem to think that because the Boeing 737 MAX has had a few accidents, it's an unsafe aircraft. But the truth is that all aircraft are inherently dangerous. Flying is risky no matter what type of plane you're flying. And that's why I always say that if you want to be a pilot, you should become one. It's a great job. Just don't expect to live a long life. Thank you very much.